Hello everyone, this is Daniel Baker and I'm so excited to be able to share with you all today about the subject of orality. The hope is that over the next couple of weeks or months, I'd be able to address a number of specific orality specific topics. And today I want to talk about why orality matters to get things kicked off. To begin, I want to share a story with you. There was a man named John, and John, he studied Arabic in university as well as education. And he got selected for a special program to come to the country of Oman and to help open a school in a rural area. So he was sent down to the southern part of the country, off into a remote mountain area, and he was the one responsible for opening this new school. And he was still working on his Arabic as he arrived in the country, but he was pretty confident, pretty happy with himself, thought he was doing pretty well. And the kids, they seemed to understand, but they didn't seem very engaged in what he was teaching. They didn't seem to take a lot away from what he was teaching. And, you know, every morning he'd say, Sabah al-Khair, they'd say Sabah al-Nur, so good morning, and then the response. There was this give and take, but actually when he began to teach them things, it was like blank faces. It's like they didn't receive the messages he was communicating. And he thought, you know, my Arabic can't be that bad. That can't be the sole problem here. Well, one night he was kept up from some noise outside, and he went outside to check on what was going on, and he realized his neighbor's house was having a bit of a party. So he went over and knocked on the door, and one of his students answered along with their father. And so he started speaking to the father in Arabic, but the father was just looking at him with a blank face and not responding. And John was thinking, my Arabic can't be that bad. How can they not understand what I'm trying to say? And eventually, once he finally shut his mouth, they gestured for him to come into the house, and he sat down. And when he took the time to listen, he heard that all around him there were voices speaking, but they weren't speaking Arabic. They were speaking a different language. And he discovered that actually the people of that town still used the local language of Jabali, the mountain language. And he began to think to himself, have I been teaching this whole time in a way that's incomprehensible to my students? And if so, what do I need to do now? You know, this is the way I've been taught to do things. This is the tool I have. This is what I'm comfortable with now. But they're not going to understand the message that I'm trying to get across. They're not going to learn from me effectively. And he began to think, am I going to have to take this big step? Am I going to have to rethink how I communicate and how I teach? Am I going to have to go through the hard process of relearning an entire new language and a new way of doing things in order for myself to be effective with this group of students and this community? And that's the end of our story for today. And I think that story poses a question for us that is relevant in terms of our subject of orality. And hopefully that question becomes a little bit more clear as time goes on throughout today's session and the next couple of weeks. What I hope today is to really introduce this subject of orality. Probably a number of you would have been familiar with this term lately, especially in different sorts of kind of missiology circles and books. It's kind of a buzzword now, but I think a lot of people maybe don't understand quite what it is that someone like myself, who considers themselves a student of orality, and this is the subject that I'm really passionate about, what is it that I mean when I talk about orality? Or what do we think we mean when we talk about orality? Orality is a bit of an unfortunate term we use to describe a really wide variety of phenomenon. Most people, probably a very basic definition of orality is that orality is the act of spoken communication, which is true. It's not wrong to say that, but that is only one part of orality. Actually, orality encompasses not just communication, but actually cultural phenomenon, logical processes, our ways of thinking, our conceptualization. It encompasses learning and educational needs and preferences. So there's this very kind of wide spectrum of phenomenon that we are trying to get after when we talk about the subject of orality. We're not just talking about communication. And that difference has big implications for a number of things. In particular, how we go about making disciples of oral people. So this can all get a little bit blurry when I try to describe what orality is, what my interest is, what I'm doing in terms of my research. I usually talk to people or try to describe to people the group, the target audience that I'm hoping to engage with, to learn from, and to reach. And I often would describe it in this way, that an oral person or oral people groups, or someone who is highly reliant on orality, they do not depend heavily on the written word in their daily lives for thought, communication, and action. So this doesn't mean that a person can't read or write, but it means they do not rely heavily on text or the written word for communication, for their thought, and for their action. And this definition encompasses a much broader audience of people than what we would typically think of as an oral person or oral people group. Many of us probably kind of have the image in mind of an uncontacted indigenous group who's never seen or interacted with text or the written word. They have zero literacy, we might say. But that's actually only one aspect, one kind of category, very specific category of orality. We might refer to that as primary orality. For me, I would define orality as a reliance on ways of communicating, learning, and relating to the world outside of ourselves that is shaped by tools, thought, and culture that are not influenced or shaped primarily by the written word. So this definition, it expands our conversation about orality from one of simply communication to one of culture, one of thought and logic, and one of behavior, and even beyond that. And you might be thinking, okay, that's nice, Daniel, but what's the point here? What's the bottom line? Why does this matter for us today? And most of us, we're readers and writers. We think we aren't oral people. But actually, that is not necessarily a true statement. Maybe it can be applied to yourself, but it certainly cannot be applied to the majority of the people living on this earth today. It's not a very helpful or accurate picture of the actual global situation. Most studies now coming back that are really looking at what orality is suggest that up to 80% of the world is highly reliant on orality. And when most of us, we first hear this number, we think that can't be right. And, you know, we get data, we get surveys back maybe from, for example, UNESCO's Institute for Statistics. Back in 2011 on Literacy Day, they suggested that 83% of adults and 89% of youth worldwide were literate. Hooray, that's a great number. But is that number representing what we think it's representing? When we think, okay, 89% of youth are literate, what are we understanding the same thing as what that statement is actually making? You know, unfortunately, this sort of reporting is not very clear, provides a lot of unhelpful perspective for most, for educators, for decision makers. There's lots of flaws actually in the picture that this sort of statement is painting. Because actually the data that make up these statements are often data, very simplistic kind of data, very binary in terms of its reporting. So people are categorized as either literate or illiterate. And some of the definitions are very, very basic. For some of the countries that are reporting, if you can read your name and write your name, you have an aspect of literacy. Therefore, you are categorized as literate. It does not tell us whether you can effectively learn from a book, interact with a book, comprehend, kind of instructions, written instructions. It does not give us any helpful indication of actually the way that person learns best or the way that person communicates best. So if we take these statistics, some of these statistics about literacy at face value, it's pretty easy to be convinced that we actually don't really need to focus too much on orality. Now, just to say, this sort of spectrum that gets put out there of orality to literacy is actually not a very accurate, it's actually not a spectrum that exists. There is this spectrum maybe of illiteracy to literacy. This has to deal with our capability of dealing with a particular technology, the technology of text. You might not have thought of written words and text as a technology, but it is. So that spectrum, literacy to illiteracy, is a way of gauging how well we handle that technology. Actually, orality is something else. It's dealing with a way of communication, a way of thinking, cultural systems, all that do not depend primarily on the written word. So it is something that's separate. They can actually exist. So you can have people who are highly literate, capable of handling this technology, capable of reading and writing, but actually who demonstrate highly oral characteristics in terms of their thinking and their culture, their communication, and their learning preferences. I can't dive into this deeply here, but you might want to do it yourself, dig a little bit deeper. You could refer to Dr. Grant Lovejoy's research. He produced a very helpful article called The Extent of Global Orality back in 2012, I think was the most recent update. That was published in the inaugural issue for the Orality Network, International Orality Network's journal. So if you want to look at that particular article, it has a lot more data kind of unpacking this and how do we get to this 80% number, this estimation that 80% of the world is actually highly reliant on orality for learning, for communication, and in terms of their thought and cultural systems. So here's the question again. Why does this matter? Why does this matter? Well, if we look at the commission, the Great Commission, the commission given to us by Jesus, we're called to go out and make followers of Jesus, to make disciples. We're called to teach them. And of course, if we're going to accomplish this task, the way we go about teaching, the way we go about communicating is very, very important. So Matthew 28, 18 through 20, it says, "And Jesus came to them and said, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age.'" So if we want to be obedient to this task, we need to be diligent in making disciples. And I'm convinced, fully convinced, if we're going to be effective in making disciples, if we're going to make disciples who are able to go and make disciples and be reproducible, then we need to think very carefully about these two important subjects: how we communicate and how we teach. Much of our communication and teaching for discipleship models is very heavily influenced by Western educational models, abstract thinking, text-based systems, and actually it does not line up very well with the needs of the majority of our global audience. Certainly some of us, we have learning preferences, but we can't let the way we disciple, we can't let the way we teach be shaped by our preferences. We need to let our communication, our teaching, our discipleship strategies be shaped by what's effective for those we are trying to reach with the good news of Jesus. We need to let the way that we go about making disciples be shaped by what's going to help them be released to go and make disciples effectively among the unreached. Virtually any audience that we come into, virtually any audience will have a majority of oral learners. This data is consistent around the world, and some of us may hear this, we may hear this number and we think, oh, it's skewed, you know, it's 80%, but maybe it's very high in the global south and maybe the global north and more developed nations or Western countries, the percentage is going to be lower. Actually, when we look at the data, for example, my country, we look at the International Adult Literacy Survey results for Americans. This was a results-based survey, so it was active testing. It wasn't just taking kind of data responses, but it was actively testing adults to see how they did with handling text. And what it found was out of 5 levels, 4 out of 5 Americans fell in the bottom 3, and the majority actually in the bottom 2 categories of capability handling text. So the majority of people, the majority of adults in the United States who were tested basically just get by. Yeah, they can read instructions on, you know, medicine bottle or, you know, recipe, whatever it may be. So technically they're literate, but are they actively using text as their way of learning, as their way of being shaped, as their way of communicating? No. Actually, they're very, very dependent on oral means for their thinking, their culture, their communication, their learning. So this is something we definitely need to have in mind. This is why I wholeheartedly believe that orality matters today. And in the upcoming weeks, I hope to follow up this section with some more practical reflections. I want to look at the approach of Jesus, how he made disciples, and how it was modeled by an actually very oral approach to teaching and communication, how he took advantage of the way of culture, the way of learning, how he took advantage of the preferences and the needs of his audience in order to be the greatest teacher, the greatest discipler. And after that, we'll also look at how we can harness orality. How can we take some of this, what we're learning both from our audience, what we're learning from the results, the extent of orality globally, how can we take that combined with the lessons we see in Scripture of how Jesus went to make disciples, and how can we harness that in order to have an approach and a strategy and tools that are learning from orality and helping us to be much more effective and released as disciple makers, so that we can be reaching those who have not yet heard the good news of Jesus. So thank you so much for taking the time to watch this today, and I'm looking forward to sharing more with you in the next couple of weeks or months.